Uh, Dear friends, dear colleagues, I'm welcoming back all of the participants of our today's conference. As I promised, as I announced in the end of our morning session, we've got a little surprise, a pleasant surprise for you now, before the regular conference continues. When the conference was already set and the program of our virtual Bloomsday was already developed and established, I was suddenly linked by the Embassy of Ireland to the very interesting YouTube project by a very interesting and intelligent young gentleman who is today with us. He is author and creator of the YouTube project. It is a literary channel called Armen and Further. As if I'm not mistaken, it was founded several years ago, but this year in particular, the project became widely popular in different, I think, areas of our social life connected to literature, to history, by the certain project or Joyce project, which means reading chapters from Ulysses and discussion of these chapters in Ulysses by 18 weeks, according to the 18 chapters of this great novel. So I want to introduce Armen Zakharyan, author and creator of this project, pass the word to him, and he will tell you a little bit the story of it. I decided to make it now because it's my time as a speaker, and I want to share this time with Armen, because in my opinion, this project is one of the most interesting things that I've seen recently for the last several years, made in YouTube to popularize Irish literature and literature on the whole. Armen, the word is yours.
Thank you so much for such a flattering introduction. I will launch now. Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you once again, and thanks for inviting me today and for sharing your time with me, Andrey. I'm so happy and proud to join this discussion, to be here today on Bloomsday among my fellow Joyceans, and to have an opportunity to speak about my project. My name is Armen Zakharyan. I'm originally from Moscow, but now I'm living in Poland. I'm a graduate of the People's Friendship University of Russia and a Spanish interpreter, but all that I believe is not so important today, because when it comes to James Joyce, I prefer the definition that Sergei Khoruzhy, the author of the first full Russian translation of Ulysses, once gave me. He said, you are a young man that is interested in Joyce. So that's how I like to call myself after that. And today I will be speaking, of course, about Joyce project that I launched earlier this year. I believe it has become a commonplace in recent years to say that we are living in the heyday of television series. From Game of Thrones to Black Mirror, from Young Pope to The Queen's Gambit, etc. But we shall remember, I think, that more than 100 years ago, Ulysses as well started in a serial form when it was first published in the Little Review magazine. Moreover, James Joyce even called his chapters, well, a 19th century author would call them chapters, and James Joyce called them episodes, a word that is nowadays strongly associated with TV shows and series. It is also very symbolic, I believe, that the first Russian translation of Ulysses, the first full publication of Ulysses in 1989, was made as well in a serial form. Therefore, as a great admirer of James Joyce's work, I got an idea a couple of years ago to make a certain number of videos dedicated to Ulysses and to publish them as well in a serial form. Back in 2018, I started to make a YouTube channel about literature. I called it Armen Further. Its content, unfortunately, nowadays is only in Russian, but I hope someday maybe I will translate some of the best videos into English or Spanish. However, in 2 years, my channel suddenly became quite popular, somewhat popular, and attracted certain attention, if I may say it like that, in Russian-speaking communities. It got almost 100,000 subscribers, which is not bad for the topic of literature. And at that point, I've launched this Joycean series that I've prepared for almost 2 years. I called this series, and I'm sorry I couldn't come up with something ingenious, the Joyce Project, or Joyce Project in Russian. So my Joyce Project consists of 19 episodes. The first one was published on the 2nd of February on James Joyce's birthday, of course, and I called it episode 0, or Introduction to Ulysses, where I tried basically to answer the simplest questions about Ulysses that a common reader might ask. What is Ulysses? Why is it considered so hard to read? Is Russian translation good enough if you cannot read the original text? And finally, why is it important to read Ulysses after all? What is it about that book that makes it so special? And after that, episode 0, over 18 weeks, from James Joyce's birthday up until today, until Bloomsday 2021, I published every week a video about every single chapter of Ulysses, from Telemachus to Penelope. My proposal to my audience was the following. Every week you read one episode of Ulysses, and every week I publish a video with the analysis of this episode. Therefore, it was, let's say, like a live guidebook, a guidebook that takes you through Ulysses from the first page to the last. One of the basic ideas that I express in the introductory episode, and that I tried to follow through the whole series, is that Ulysses, vastly speaking, is a book where, quoting Sergei Khorozhий, the Russian translator of the novel, the inversion of form and content took place. And we can see repeatedly in Ulysses how form becomes content. Therefore, the main difference between my series of videos and many other guides through Ulysses that exist is that I was trying to focus mainly on form, on James Joyce's style, on how he changed as a writer from the early episodes of the book up until the end, how he replaced one technical device with the other, etc. In order to achieve that, first of all, I speak about the style in my videos. I speak about the style of writing, focusing before anything else on how is it written and why in a certain episode Joyce uses certain technique. And second of all, I try to include in my episodes elements of, let's say, maybe not elements, but traces of the same technical devices that James Joyce used in his book. For example, I threw in some newspaper headlines in the 7th episode. Then in the 10th episode, I used interpolation, cutting few parts of my video during the editing process and inserting these parts in different places of the episode. Of course, the 11th episode is all musical, as you can imagine. And in the 13th episode, my narrator's speech, let's say my speech, involves the use of cliché. In the 16th episode, it is spoiled with the clumsy character of Joyce's narrator, and so on. So that is my Joyce project, and that is how it works. And of course, it's too early now to speak about the outcome of this adventure, because the very adventure is not over yet. The last episode of our project dedicated to Penelope is being published today. What's more, the premiere of the episode is taking place on my channel right now when I speak here today. However, I can already say that a few thousand people read Ulysses for the first time with our project. And for them, as it was once for us, I believe, it was a life-changing experience. And I'm just so happy that my project could be helpful in that way. And maybe in the future, in some other ways, it will be helpful as well. Thank you so much for your attention. Once again, it's great to be here today, and I want to wish all of you a happy Bloomsday. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armen, for that. It was very nicely introduced, and now I'm welcoming any comments or remarks or questions from our audience, from people from Russia or Ireland, if they have. We still have some time for that, please. Colleagues. Natalia Nikolaevna, yes.
As usual, I am popping out with a question. Armen, what is your attitude to the product which is known as Ulysses, a graphic novel? I'm sure you are familiar with that theme, which is studied in American universities, for example, alongside traditional novel, and is treated very seriously. What do you think of it? And have you used any ideas from there in your project?
Thank you for the question. Of course, I've read about it. I believe that it is a very interesting field to discover, and very interesting field from where you can learn. So I find it very useful. Although I didn't use it in my work, I used primary text sources, but I think that yes, it can be useful, and in that field we should maybe look for the future research and for the future projects. I can imagine how it can work, and I think it's very interesting for the 21st century, when all sorts of forms, not only texts but videos, graphic novels, even comic books, they are melting in this new pot of medias in which we live. So I think it's a very interesting field.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
May I say something?
Yes, of course, Tatiana Nikolaevna, please.
Well, thank you, Armen, for this very short but very beautiful presentation. I absolutely agree that, you know, now we need to go to these means of communication, because they are more, well, they are better for younger people, and they really do this, and they prefer readings like that to readings in the classroom or somewhere else. So I think that you are doing a great job. So my question is about the, well, these posters, or whatever you call them, that you demonstrated. Is it, yes, these, and well, they are actually great, but who did that? Because, you know, in my view, well, everything influences your perception. And this videos or whatever you can see, they will influence your perception of people who are reading with you. So did you do them yourself, or do you have some artist who helps you?
Sure. This is the work of a Russian artist. Her name is Polina, and she helped me throughout the whole project. She volunteered when I announced the project. She was a follower of my YouTube channel, and she said that she's an artist and she wants to participate. I said, okay, but it was like in January, and in February we were going to start Joyce project, and I said, yeah, but you don't have enough time. You'll have to make it every week. Are you ready to jump into it? And she did. I think that she did a great job, and we can see even an evolution of her works. She herself considers the later works more interesting than the earlier works. I think she did a great job. And an interesting thing is how she came up with these images. So I never showed her the episode that I make about the chapter. She just read the chapter and she discussed with me like some crucial points that are important. Like, for example, here in the episodes to the sirens, yeah, we talked about the music and how music is important. And you can see so many signs, so many traces of music in this picture. So I believe she did a great job. And in all the episodes of Joyce Project that you can find on my YouTube channel, if you open the description of the video, there's a link to her Instagram and to her page in Vkontakte. So anyone can find her, come in contact with her, and subscribe to her Instagram. It's called Polina Zero, Polina Nol. And I think she's fabulous, and I admire her work. Thank you for noticing that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Any other remarks and questions, please, colleagues? Yes, Joseph, you're welcome.
Yeah. Очень рад слышать о вашем проекте. I want to know, can you send me the link? The link
was there, I think, on the screen. Yeah, I remember.
I don't see it.
Yes, here.
Here.
I actually say good. Okay, my YouTube. Okay, good.
Yes,
good.
you will find it all on my YouTube channel. It's
okay. Write this down. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions or remarks, please? Well, I have a remark, in fact, and it was my idea to discuss it a little with Armen now, because when I first saw the project, when I started to watch the series, one of the first things that came up to my mind was now we have a product which by form corresponds to idea of the influencing the new generation of readers and spectators. And that what I always was taken by in the projects made by Leonid Parfenov, my favorite Russian journalist. Because in my opinion, his Parthenon YouTube channel is really the best product made in a sort of harmony of how things are comprehended in form and content. Because there are a lot of interesting channels in YouTube, hundreds, thousands, with a lot of information, lectures, online seminars, conferences, and all that kind of things. But there are just a few of them, I think, in the whole world that can find this harmony of form and content in order to make things not too long, but not too short, neither too complicated, but very dense and very profound. And when I watched your first two videos of your project, it immediately came up to my mind that finally we have something in sphere of literature for modern generation of people, which corresponds to this idea which Parfenov continues and successfully establishes in his Parthenon channel. Do you agree with me? And do you think that there is such sort of influence over your channel? Of course, it is a very different thing, but still.
Well, I am afraid it's going to be not modest enough to say, yeah, of course, I agree with this comparison, because it's rather flattering. I believe Parfenov and his work is just great.
But the method itself. Well.
Yeah, I can agree with that. For me, form is very important. And I'm trying not to focus on the content only. And that is a certain link between what he does and between what I do. And I believe that it is important to pay attention to this side of work, especially when it comes to Ulysses, because in Ulysses, form is so important. And on my channel, I have other videos. The most popular video on my channel is about Nikolai Gogol, where I speak about his language only in terms of form. analyzing how he used the language to create an image. And I believe that this orientation towards form is, well, one of the missions of my channel. That's why Ulysses was so important, and that's why we paid so much attention to it. And I'm so grateful for the words you say about my project. It's very flattering.
I can say that element of entertainment, that's what we all need when we are talking about serious things. That's what Joyce has meant by his novel. That's what his contemporaries who became great poets and writers meant in their work. And that's what we lack sometimes and what we need to find this contemporary language of perception. That's why I think that element of entertainment is always important. People who know me, they know I try to use it always in my own open lectures and all our events of the Irish Center. We always try to find this form of a Napoleon pie where people can take one or the other from the product, be it together an entertainment and a serious discussion and the lecture. So, Tatiana, you wanted to add?
Oh, no, it was just showing.
It was an exclamation, yeah.
It's great.
Well, if nobody else had any remarks or questions to Armen, well, then thank you very much for that. I'm Philip. Philip, you wanted to say something?
I wasn't really asking to speak just now, but I hugely admire what Armen is doing. It's really wonderful work. I'm really fascinated by everything we've just heard and those wonderful illustrations with Celtic echoes in them.
Yes, Celtic revival influence, of course, is quite significant in these pictures. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Okay, now we follow our conference. Thank you, Armen, once again, and we hope to make certain things together in future, in the nearest future, in the field of Irish literature. And now we continue our conference, and I will make my own talk abridged, as I promised, because half of the time we spent now with Armen. So I won't focus much in details of two works of the Russian Silver Age I wanted to discuss with you, but I will say probably the principal things. These two works of the Russian Silver Age, to this or that way connected to Ireland and Irish subjects, are the poem written by Zinaida Gippius, a famous Russian symbolist poet, in September 1917, and it is called Why? And the second text is probably more important for the Irish-Russian literary rings of that time, because it is fully devoted to the Irish epic theme. It is Nikolai Gumilev's play or dramatic poem, sometimes it's better to call it that way, Gondola, based on the subject of the Irish epos. But to start, I want to show you the picture. No, not this. The picture of this lady. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's Zinaida Vengerova, who was already mentioned today in our morning section by Tatiana Ivanova in her talk about John Synge. Zinaida Vengerova played the principal part in introducing the Celtic revival to the Russian literary circles connected to the Russian symbolist poetry. And this merit of attracting attention of the Russian Silver Age to the Irish culture really belongs to this lady. She was not a very original poet, but a very talented translator. And she was author of the first Russian translations of W.B. Yeats and John Synge. which we mentioned already today in the morning. And she was also the person who introduced the plays and the poems by W.B. Yeats and John Synge and George Russell and the book of Lady Augusta Gregory to during the regular meetings of the symbolists held in the attic apartment of the famous so-called tower of Vyacheslav Ivanov, who was the head of this group. There they discussed the new forms for new poetry and drama during these regular studios. And it was Vengerova who introduced Yeats's latest works and Synge's latest works in the end of 1910s. But today, it will be more important to mention other Zinaida Gippius, who wrote this very strange and significant poem, which is called Why, where suddenly she described the legendary image of Ireland, where she'd never been in her life. And in many ways, the public perceived this poem as a part of Russian intellectuals' reaction to the events of the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin. The thoughts and the feelings of Gippius, if they had not yet acquired some logic and final form, were already filled in this poem with some longing and some epic sadness, in which fans of Celtic revival surely could recognize the influence of latest Yeats and Synge's works. I will read this short poem in Russian and English now so that you can imagine what I am talking about. Почему? О, Ирландия океанная, мной невиденная страна, почему ее зыбь туманная в ясность здешнего вплетена? И я не думал о ней, не думаю, я не знаю ее, не знал. Почему так режут тоску мою лезвие ее острых скал? Как я помню зори надпенные, в черной алости чаек стон, или памятью мира пленную прохожу я сквозь ткань времен. О, Ирландия неизвестная, о, Россия, моя страна, не едина ль мука крестная всей Господней земле дана. Now I'll read the same poem in my own translation. O island, the ocean country, distant land that I've never seen, why your swilling mist in this clearness is entwined in a sort of a dream. I don't think of her, neither did before. I don't know her, I never did. Why my grief so caught by her rocky cliffs is if I lost in them what I need. How could I remember your rope foamy dawns, seagulls mourning in black scarlet lines, or being captured by the world's memory, I'm passing through the cloth of times. O island, the land of mystery, O Russia, my native land, is it cross travails that unite us now by the Lord, keeping all in his hand? If we look at how the real Ireland of that time is united with the mystical land of reverie from Yeats's work, it will be the only existing example that we have in the history of the Russian Silver Age poetry. Unfortunately, there is now no left evidence of how Gippius directly reacted on the events of Easter Rising in spring 1916. But we can only assume that those events happened on the eve of the Russian Revolution, understanding that the world they all knew before is never existing anymore, that the values so much appreciated before distracted, ruined by the new time, was realized in such complicated way in this piece of the symbolic poetry. And we also know from the history of literature that after Zinaida Gippius emigrated, she returned several times to her earlier interest to the Celtic revival. The Irish literature and mythology on the whole. I quote, "We understood that there was something in common in the air. We could not give it a name, but we tried to find philosophic way to put it into artistic practice." Here I want to show you the collection of poems, which is called Revolution, which was published already after 1917, before Zinaida Gippius emigrated, and then republished in emigration. And a very curious and distinguished fact that I want to mention before I turn to the second piece of the Silver Age literature is that this poem, this little poem Y, in this collection of poems is between very tough and very dramatic political poems of Zinaida Gippius about Russian Revolution. The collection starts with a very optimistic poem written in March 1917, right after the February Revolution, which she strongly backed, as well as all other members of the literary circles of the Russian Silver Age. And then it was this little poem Y in September 1917, connected to Ireland. And right after that, there was a dozen of very tragic, dramatic poems after the events of October 1917 and the Bolshevik coup d'etat, which Zinaida Gippius never compromised, as well as other participants of the Russian Silver Age. Now, I want to turn to the second piece of the Russian Silver Age literature, maybe the most important when we speak about the connection to the Easter Rising 1916 events and to the Irish literature of that time. That's Nikolai Gumilev's play Gondola. Here I wanted to show you this very famous photograph made right after the first period of the Great War was over, in the end of 1914, when Gumilev was in his first break, in his first vacation from the front. He returned to St. Petersburg, and here is his photograph with his wife, famous Russian poet Anna Akhmatova, and their son Lev. And if you look at this photo, you see that Gumilev already has this Order of St. George, marked by this special order, which was given to him, praised to him for his unparalleled courage in the front during the war with Germany. Speaking about Gondola, the first text of Gondola, the first variant of Gondola, was written and published in 1916, right after Easter Rising events in Dublin. The main character of this play is a character of the ancient Irish epic, and the very image of the mythology of Ireland is key to understanding Nikolai Gumilev's response to the events of the Easter Rising. But the event which was critically important to linking Celtic revival with the Russian Silver Age and with the second edition of Gondola was Nikolai Gumilev's personal meeting with W.B. Yeats in London in summer 1917. It was already it was not the beginning, it was already the time of the Russian Revolution, but Nikolai Gumilev was in a special secret intelligence mission because he served also as an intelligence officer for the Russian Imperial headquarters. He accomplished a Nordic trip via Sweden to Norway, and then settled down in Britain for several months, together with his close friend Boris Anrep, who was also a famous artist, but who already established himself as a figure known for the British artistic and literary circles. Among those important among those important meetings, he met Olivia Shakespeare, who was a close friend of W.B. Yeats in his younghood and also his lover, his first lover. And Olivia Shakespeare was merely the person who organized this meeting in one of the most famous literary saloons, where Nikolai Gumilev met first Chesterton. In his creative works he was really interested, and W.B. Yeats. For Gumilev, it was a very important period of time because he turned, after pupil writing, after Valery Brusov, his personal mentor in poetry, another key figure of Russian symbolism, into writing in a very different style. He decided to overcome Russian symbolism, as he declared in several important works. And he invented his own literary school, which was called Acmeism, with his closer companions, his wife Anna Akhmatova, and his friends Osip Mandelstam, George Ivanov, and some others, who later became very famous poets and whose fame even overcame Gumilev's own. The main idea of the school was a return to the fully weighted word, to the highest master of artist's craft, a kind of overcoming symbolism and with these symbolic mists, but with containing basic symbolic images, designed in a different way. Meeting Yeats, whom Gumilev calls in a letter to Akhmatova, their Vyacheslav, means Vyacheslav Ivanov, makes a great impression on him. In an updated version of the play, first published in 1918, the influence of Yeats's poetics becomes much more evident, despite Gumilev contained his unique ballad style. This meeting was important also because Gumilev at that period of time was very interested in another Yeats's idea of founding a certain so-called druidic order of artists, where poets, writers, and artists being regarded as the new knights of the 20th century who keep some eternal values in the demolished world, in the universe of destruction around them, founded by the Great War and the events and revolutions in different European countries. So the idea of such new druidic order was interesting for him, and he used this discussion with Yeats for his further poetry of his latest collection. Besides being poet, Gumilev participated in great way, as I said, as volunteer soldier. So he was different from the other Silver Age major figures because he was both a person of art and a person of action. It happened that Yeats was in his own brief trip to London from Dublin at that time, where he too was probably conducting some unofficial diplomatic negotiations between some representatives of the British elite with Irish revolutionaries, because it was a very tough time, of course, after his rising. We do not know the exact date of this meeting because neither Gumilev nor Anrey left any precise evidence about that. But we know that it was in the early days of June 1970. After that, this conversation definitely influenced not only rewriting the beginning and the ending of Gondola, but also the attempts of Gumilev to make translation of W.B. Yeats' Countess Kathleen, and also persuading his followers in the workshop of poets to continue translation of Yeats, Synge, and other writers. By the way, Kornei Chukovsky, who started to work on the translation of John Synge's Playboy of the Western World, which was mentioned by Tatiana in her talk earlier today was also influenced by his discussions with Gumilev, who was really taken by some works of the Celtic Revival authors. When we read this play, Gondola, the second edition of this play written in the form of dramatic poem, we see that it is full of legendary allegories and mythological imagery. It is all of they devoted to the Irish epic legend of Gondola. And we certainly understand that Massacre of Easter Rising could not but influence Gumilev, who was that time in his own sake for the new form of poetry and drama. I do not have time really to speak in details about the play itself. I want only to mention that while reading it, we comprehend the diversity of several plot lines and their combinations in the play. The events in the end turned out that Gondola first lost his position as a fiancé to the Icelandic princess and the heir to the throne, and he is doomed to be killed by the barbarian Icelandic militaries. But then suddenly, when the group of Irish militaries appeared on the Icelandic shore, they brought the news that his own father, not the king but the Fili, the bard, was elected the new king after the old king died, and suddenly in the very end Gondola returned to himself this position of proclaimed heir of both Iceland and Ireland. And here, when everything became so positive and this key moment of the play, Gondola sacrificed himself, which of course is Gumilev's response to the events of Easter Rising on the one hand, and his response to the world, to the mission of artists in this world of destruction on the other hand, because Gondola proposed to the Icelandic tribe to be Christianized, and they became afraid of the new faith, and he decided to sacrifice himself in the name of Christ, and in that way buying this new belief to the barbaric Iceland. The story of Gumilev's play ends when he sacrificed himself, but one of the most beautiful and complicated part of this play is its ending, when Gondola already died and Princess Lera, so there's a daytime and nighttime name for her, she made a speech on the dead body of Gondola, speaking how she will put his body into the ship and made this travel into the open sea, to the ocean of love, to the ocean of eternity, which is strongly influenced by W.B. Yeats' approach to the beginning and ending part of his own plays of that time, the so-called plays for the dancers, like the Hawkswell and of course the Only Jealousy of Emer. I don't want to read now, but what I want to do is to show you a little extract from the public performance that we did together with my big friend Philip McDonagh. He will be the next speaker, and he will follow the theme of Nikolai Gumilev's poetry and drama, because Philip made the only existing translation of this play into English language. But now I want you to listen to the ending part of our public performance, which we made together with Philip in Dublin, in the Hugh Lane Gallery, the City Gallery of Dublin, in June 2018. And a brilliant Irish musician, Uilleann pipes player Kevin Rawson, also a friend of Philip, helped us in this performance. Now, Tatiana Nikolaevna, you will probably help me if I do something wrong.
Начало, да,
yes, I already made this. Now.
Тогда открываем демонстрацию экрана, потом совместное использование звука, а потом.
But I think that I need first to find. to find the file.
Вы его уже открывали, он, скорее всего, у вас открыт.
Вот пытаюсь найти. Видимо, я его закрыл во время презентации.
А, тогда открывайте.
Сейчас, одну секундочку. Just 1 second, please. That's it. That's it. Now I'm here and share. Is it working? Is it working?
Working, все хорошо.
Okay.
Now that Mcdonough is dead, there's not really any place to christen her, and the Irish warriors are going home, and there's a sense of everything ending inconclusively. But then Lera, in the last speech of the play, addresses the whole group in this speech. You yourselves know, in the blue gloaming of heaven, there is no death. In heaven's realm, with snow-cold lips, he brushes my warm lips, Ganga, beloved, gentle, and passionate. Ganga, brother with lowered eyes, thinks of my good. You are both looking, full of authority and power, and white swan of the Irish days. Yes, Ganga, I have dated, loved him, who said, I love you once upon a time. All of you, swans or angels, break the rock up to the cliff, lay down his body with prayer. The light say, will fill itself. A road will rise to meet us through the broad ways of the long night, and there I be, alone with the crown prince, and not let go of rudder and helm, as long as winds lash the enormous old sea, and clouds are swimming above. And so we take our way, from life, from death. My brother, do you hear this in the speech? For we are going away to a swan place, a place not of this earth. Love's open sea, the open sea of love.
Вы знаете сами, смерти нет. В небесах луны, в небесах снеговые бураны. Он коснется даже моих. Он жених мой, и нежный, страстный брат, склонивший задумчивый взор. Он король величавый властный, белый мир, один ходил. Да, он мой, ненавистный, любимый, но сказавший люди верили всякими, придите к звездам. Один. Трудно жить мне осторожно, легкий парус на улице знак. На здоровье отца невозможно. Почему? Широким волнам. Я одна скорее, чем сяду. Герои брошен пока. Хлещет ветер морскую команду. И поел в лугу. Пока уйдем от смерти, от жизни, брака. Слышишь ли речь любви? Неземного, крепки, очи, по свободному. Николай Ulysses' tragic fate resembles his main character, Leuven. In August 1921, he was shot as a participant of the counter-revolutionary plot by the personal order who was in the name.
announcement of his play staged in January 1922 after his death proves it. And now today's evening, which becomes an important moment of widespread Mcdonough's name in the world, is thankful to Philip's translation. And I am very grateful that Philip McDonagh was first in the world to make it possible for people to read Nicolas play in English language. Thank you.
Okay, that was it, and that was the conclusion of my own talk, and I decided to make it that way to gradually pass the word to the next speaker. If you're not, if you don't mind, we won't stop on remarks and questions now, but then after Philip's talk, you are welcome to ask questions both to him and to myself. Now I pass the word to Dr. Philip McDonagh, my good friend, a wonderful Irish poet and former Irish ambassador to the Russian Federation in 2009, 2013, with whom we made a lot of interesting cross-cultural projects. Philip, I pass the word to you to follow our Gumilyov's line today.
Thank you very much, Andrey. It's wonderful to take part in Bloomsday in St. Petersburg and to meet so many old friends. It's particularly appropriate, I think, to talk about Gondola today for a number of reasons. One is that you, Andrey, are the person who introduced me to the play and told me how important it was. A second reason is that this is the 100th anniversary of Nikolai Gumilyov's death. That will be in August. And it strikes me also that in Ulysses, there is a passage referring to the assassination of the Russian Governor General of Finland, which was news on that day in 1904. And Joyce calls the Governor General the Lord Lieutenant of Finland, using the term that would be used for the British representative in Ireland. So Joyce in Ulysses is actually inviting us to reflect on the theme I want to explore, which is what kind of revolution was possible and desirable in Russia or Ireland or Europe at that time. Because it seems to me that was the question on the minds of many of the great writers, including Gumilyov and Yeats. This dialogue between Ireland and Russia about politics goes back, I think, to the 18th century. Lomonosov translated Oliver Goldsmith, which captures in itself 2 points. One is what we call in Ireland the land question, because the deserted village is really about the use of land. And it also captures this issue of where poetry and art intersects with politics, which I think is this major theme in both Irish and Russian literature. Now, I know we want to talk about Gumilyov and 1916 and 1917, but I think we can't really do that without first thinking for a moment about Pushkin. It seems to me that the questions that were in the minds of the poets of that period, the Silver Age, the Acmeists, and on the other hand, the Irish poets, those questions were framed in practice in the age of Pushkin. There was this debate between Byron and Shelley about how poetry changes the world. And Byron, of course, went off to fight in a war in which he died. And Thomas Moore was very familiar with the same question. Thomas Moore was a friend of Robert Emmet, who was executed, of course, in Dublin. And Thomas Moore narrowly avoided being implicated in revolution himself, just as Pushkin considered himself lucky not to have been arrested at the time of the Decembrists' action. So Byron Shelley and Thomas Moore in the English-speaking world were reflecting in parallel with Pushkin and his contemporaries on this question. And for me, the most important text is Pushkin's Kapitanskaya Dochka, because in that short work, Pushkin says explicitly that he's not in favor of révolution à la Russe. He's not in favor of revolution, but he is in favor of a gradual improvement in morals and customs. And Pushkin, as we know, had a very exalted view of what poetry meant. He says in that famous poem that his work rises higher than the Alexander column. And he also says that, if I recall correctly, that poetry is nirukutvarenia. That must be an allusion to the New Testament. So poetry has a very high function in informing conscience. But Pushkin and Thomas More did not want to move straight to revolution. They wanted to have a long-term strategy. And I think the same question came up over many years in the period before the First World War, probably in many different European cultures. Yeats had this phrase that something was in gestation. And I think in many different places, this was the feeling that some kind of radical change was on the way. And the question was, what would this be? Would it be a change in values as well as in structures? And what kind of actions would it require? I think there was a philosophical question in the 19th century raised by Kierkegaard and others about whether the right action is what we would consider normally an ethical action, or is it in some way original? And is it even possible that we might be obliged in conscience to do something that is, quote, wrong, unquote. And people discussed the whole story of Abraham and Isaac in that light. Now, I personally don't think there's any need to go there. There's no need to go to the position where you do something wrong. But I think you do need to consider the possibility of action that falls outside obvious categories. And in a moment, I'm going to discuss that with reference to a number of works of literature. But I would say first that 1917 for me is a quite significant year for this discussion for a number of reasons. One is that, as Andrey said, it's the year that Gumilyov came to Britain and other countries on a diplomatic mission. And I wonder whether there were feelers possibly being put out by the provisional government for peace. When I visited the archives of the Russian Foreign Ministry to look at Irish material, they told me that much of the material I might be looking for would be in the archives of the Comintern, which I never got to see. But they produced for me a British diplomatic note to the Russians, which I think was 1917. And they said, this might interest you. And this was a demand from the British not to admit the Holy See into any future peace conference. Now, at that time, the Pope was trying to broker peace in Europe. And somehow this question of whether the poets could come together and whether religious figures could come together and somehow build bridges was a live issue. And I'm not a trained historian to look at that, but I wonder, was Gumilyov's mission in 1917 as completely hopeless as it looks to us? I think also in 1917, a lot of the idealism of the pre-war period had been disillusioned by the war, and there was a sense that all the options which people had been considering before the war were overtaken by events. And James Connolly, the Irish socialist leader who was executed in 1916, he didn't speak at his court-martial, but he wrote a small 2-page note, which he handed over. And in the note, he made really one central argument, which was that whatever was done in Dublin in the rebellion was better than what was happening in Europe in the war. So it's a very interesting kind of ethical reflection. And Joyce, whom we've been talking about, he also very pointedly stayed away from the war in Ulysses, which must have been largely written during the war. And I just have one small autobiographical point to make. When I was in my first posting, I visited the editorial board of the newspaper called Il Piccolo in Trieste, where Joyce had been a contributor. And they told me that Joyce had made his main character Jewish because of his interest in the huge synagogue in Trieste. But then they said, would you like to meet someone who met Joyce? And I said, I'd be really happy. So they arranged for me on the same day to visit Italo Svevo's daughter, who was then well into her 80s. Madame, she was known as Signora Fonda Zavio. And she basically told me that Joyce was very detached as regards the outcome of the war. He didn't take sides in the war, and that confirms what we see in the novel itself, in Ulysses. He simply avoids the war. And finally, I think 1917 is very interesting, and this is another autobiographical point. My grandfather, my mother's father, was briefly head of the Irish Republican Brotherhood when other leaders had been executed in 1916. And in May 1917, he proposed, and the proposal was accepted, that they should send a mission to Russia. And that story unfolded over the following years. And it didn't have a happy ending, largely on the question of religion, because the people in Dublin realized by about 1920 that things were not going well for religion in the new system in Russia. And so they didn't follow up as strongly as they might have on the initiative. But it's just interesting as a sign of what was going on in 1917 when Gumilev met Yeats. Now I will just turn to these plays I've been looking at to prepare for today. And I haven't been able to fully organize any theory, but I've read 4 Irish plays which all help us to understand what happened in 1916. And obviously the people that you mentioned, Andrey, in Vyacheslav Ivanov's circle, they must have been looking at most of these plays as well. So the first of them is the Countess Kathleen, which Gumilev was working on at the time of his death. The second is The King's Threshold. And the third is The Revolutionist by Terence MacSweeney. The first 2 are by Yeats. And then the fourth one is The Singer by Pearse, who was effectively the leader in 1916. Now, the Countess Kathleen, there's no time to go into it in huge depth, but it's set in a time of famine, a time of trial, when most of the people are following a policy of short-term selfishness, and they've given up their religion, they've given up their ideals. And then the Countess Kathleen, who belongs to the gentry, the landed class, she first of all sells all her goods to help the poor, and then finally she sells her soul to 2 demons to help the poor. And it seems to suggest that generous action at a time of trial has to fall outside conventional moral thinking. I mean, that's the minimum conclusion you can reach. Now, at the time, it was controversial between believers and non-believers, but I think looking at it from our perspective of today, it's not shocking for a religious believer at all. The Countess Kathleen is a sympathetic person, and in the play, in the end, she's rescued by the angels when she dies because her motives were so good. But this idea of acting outside conventional thinking. You can see it in Gondola as well. It's a key idea, and I'm just going to read one small passage in my translation from Gondola about moral discernment, because Gondola says, first of all, will I do this? Then he says, will I do that? And then the answer turns out to be some third thing, which is darker and harder to understand. Shall I become the ruler of these islands, rising like columns from the ocean's depths, 2 smiles on the face of the sea? Or is it more simple? Off to the land of swans, the kindly maples and the dewy roses, the vales that my heart knows, for which I'm longing almost to fever point. No, neither. I am afflicted in the guts with pity. For what, I don't know. And I scan memory for some significance forgotten, a thing remembered that I can't remember. And worry is about me like the wings, the flapping wings of some black bird of sadness. I think that idea that a person is reaching out for something that he can't remember is in Mandelstam's Lastochka as well. The thought I had, I cannot remember. And it seems to be very much in the spirit of those times. Now I'll turn from the Countess Kathleen briefly to the King's Threshold. And the King's Threshold is a much simpler play. It's about a poet who goes on hunger strike on the threshold of the king because the king has decided to exclude poets from the Council of State. And this is the play that probably most influenced Gondola. And it has a simple structure. The poet is on stage throughout, and a number of people, his pupils, politicians, young women, his fiancée, they all come and beg him to give up the hunger strike, but he cannot. Now, in fact, Yeats, he doesn't allow the poet to die in the 1903 version, but after Terence MacSwiney, the Lord Mayor of Cork, actually carried out a hunger strike to the death, Yeats rewrote the end of the play so that the poet Shanahan would die, which is an extraordinary read across from life to art. But the overall theme here is that poetry is above politics, but must engage with politics and can appeal to the people directly over the heads of the rulers. And that this will have its effect in an unpredictable way. And the play includes this small passage about, long-throated swans upon the waves of time. These are the good people of future generations who will learn from the poet. And that whole motif of the swans and the future is all written into Gondola. I have various quotations from the play earmarked, but I don't think I'll read them now, but I'll go on to The Revolutionist, play of 1914, written by Terence MacSwiney, who was himself a revolutionist and who died on hunger strike in 1920. This is a play about the importance of self-sacrifice because it unifies the efforts of people who may not be working together. And then finally, there's the play The Singer by Pearse, which for me is the most interesting of the plays, because first of all, it shows that the motive of the revolution was to help the poor. I'll just read one. I should say first, this is a revolution, a fictitious revolution in Ireland, but of course it anticipates the rebellion that actually took place. And I should say maybe before I read this passage, the play revolves around a hero who's a poet. And first of all, he's a poet who writes the poems that holds the community together in adversity. But secondly, he becomes an organizer. So he crosses the line from, you might say, journalism to activism. And then thirdly, he's in a position where he is the individual who can trigger the rebellion. And at that point, he decides that he can't as one person do this, that it's necessary that there should be some kind of common understanding of what should be done. But in the end, his brother triggers the rebellion, and the poet, the singer, goes out unarmed to face his death, because his death can have a great symbolic meaning. So that's the plot, but I'm just going to read the passage about the poet's view of why he is doing all this. I have lived with the homeless and with the breadless, the poor, the poor. I have seen such sad childings, such bare marriage feasts, such candleless wakes. In the pleasant country places I have seen them, but oftener in the dark, unquiet streets of the city. My heart has been heavy with the sorrow of mothers. My eyes have been wet with the tears of children. The people, the dumb, suffering people, reviled and outcast, yet pure and splendid and faithful. In them I saw the face of God, a tear-stained face, but it is the holy face. So it was something of a revelation to me that this is where Pearse was coming from. But these are 4 poems which all focus on poets and prophets and their leadership. They're people who are not in their nature politicians. And I think that this brings me to how Gumilyov saw his role. And maybe I won't try to say too much, Andrey, about this, because you've already described what the Acmeists stood for. But the key point is that there's something beyond politics, which politics needs to remember. That was also Mandelstam's vision, and I think Akhmatova's vision. So it's not that you seek a confrontation, but at the same time, you don't identify with the way I think arguably some of the poets did in Russia, like Mayakovsky. And you don't withdraw from the public square completely, which I think could have been how some of the symbolists might have seen the solution. But you write somehow truthfully about life and the world, and if necessary, you pay the price for this if it brings you into conflict with power. And all of this is part of the same dialogue that was going on among the Irish poets and writers. Now, I wonder, could I just hazard a couple of thoughts here about Gumilyov? I've already wondered whether his mission in 1917 was completely hopeless, or could it have been seen as one strand in some kind of effort to emerge from the war by the provisional government. Secondly, Gumilyov does seem to have made a huge effort to somehow earn the trust of the authorities of his time. Some people here will know this much better than me, but Evgeny Schwartz was involved in the first production of Gondola in Rostov-na-Don, and I think Schwartz managed throughout his career to keep the bridges open, to the powers that be. And Gumilyov also negotiated with Maxim Gorky about whether Gondola could be read as some kind of historical, almost documentary play about the Middle Ages. And then Gumilyov tried to present Gondola, I think, to that audience in 1920 as a play about world views. It's a clash of world views, which would have appealed to the new powers that be in Russia. And I think that, I asked myself, why did he tackle the Countess Kathleen in 1921? And part of the answer might be that the figure who most resembles the Countess Kathleen in Irish political life is Constance Markievicz, who was the Countess Markievicz, and her husband fought in the Russian cavalry in the First World War. Now, I don't know who could find out whether he could ever have crossed Gumilyov's path, but I'm sure that when Yeats met Gumilyov in 1917, Yeats will have said, by the way, the Countess Markievicz, who seems to have looked very carefully at my play, her husband fought like you in the cavalry in Russia. So I think that alone would have attracted Gumilyov to the play, but also the Countess Kathleen is also a play about world views, because the villains of the Countess Kathleen are the merchants, and the victims are the ordinary people who fall into the hands of the merchants. And what the Countess Kathleen is trying to do, you could argue, is to revive a genuine culture and also a belief in God among the people by her just actions. So Gumilyov, if he was involved, as indeed the Irish, the unofficial Irish Parliament was involved in trying to build bridges to the Bolsheviks, he might have thought the Countess Kathleen was an interesting play, because the Countess Kathleen is not an Orthodox Christian figure, but she is a Christian figure, I think, and she takes the side of the poor in a clash of world views. So those are just some thoughts about Gumilyov. And I'd like to conclude by arguing that this whole debate is extremely relevant to all of us today. I was in a Zoom call with a number of Jewish theologians on Monday, to mark the retirement of a wonderful Jewish theologian called Peter Oakes, who's based in America and the University of Virginia. And what surprised me was how many of them were very worried about the world. One of them said, you know, our generation of Jewish theologians came out of the Holocaust, and now a new generation of theologians will have to consider, climate change, pandemic, and all the other challenges which global society is facing, the disorder of the world. So it was a dark view. And in that kind of world, I think we need to get away from this idea of free choice as the essence of the political process. For good reasons, during the Enlightenment, there was a reaction against some of the powers in the religious sphere who were seen as having too much control. But the alternative that seems to have emerged of an open marketplace with absolutely free choice and no common sense of direction, it doesn't seem to be viable. Freedom seems to need responsibility, and freedom as responsibility needs some kind of overarching project or some kind of overarching sense of where we might be going. So we're at that kind of cultural moment in which it seems that, as Gumilyov wanted, religion and revolution can come together again. So I won't maybe say too much more about that at the moment, but this center that I've been developing in Dublin City University is all about that. It's about the present historical moment and the need for politics and religion to find one another again. And for me, finding a role for poetry is almost the same as finding a role for religion, as I think Pushkin or many of those other thinkers would have said. So thank you very much, Andrey, for giving me this opportunity to think, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you very much. It was always, as always, it was very interesting to listen to your ideas, to overthinking the similarities and differences of epochs of creative figures. Thank you for that. And I want to ask our colleagues and friends, do you have any questions for Philip and for me? Because I did not reply on any after my own talk. If you have, please, you are welcome. Any questions or remarks or comments or what you heard during my talk and Philip's? Joseph, you want it?
Unmute, 1 second. Hello,
yeah.
Hello,
Yes.
Philip. I'm not able to follow you completely, but I'm very interested in what you said about Yeats rewriting The King's Threshold. I didn't know about that. That's fascinating. I followed that up. I just wrote an article for Dermot Keogh, way out of my competence, on the hunger strikers and the Catholic Church, with reference to was reference to the iconic figure in my school, the North Monastery, Cork, who was, of course, Terence McSween.
Yes.
And of course, I'm very skeptical and I approach it from different angles. But religion and politics, you know, they mixed perhaps too intimately in the Irish so-called revolution. And I think we have to, you know, sift that and see what was really going on, you know, and what are the values at stake. I mean, I must say now, much as I adored McSweeney and Pearse in my childhood and my youth, now I find them very disturbing. You know, when Terence McSweeney was arrested, he said, hunger strike. He knew exactly what he was going to do. Pearse, of course, also had that radical decisiveness, but that's rather a religious attitude, which can lead in all directions, you know, can lead in very bad directions as well, you know, has happened both in the Irish Civil War and in the so-called Troubles. And I remain troubled.
Yes, what could I say? I think, first of all, I would say that we have to draw a line between what happened up to the Civil War and what happened after that. You know, I think there's been a tendency in some places to try to assimilate the Northern Ireland Troubles to the events of 1916 to 1923. And I personally think that's wrong. You know, I think the Irish state became legitimate in a way which ruled out what was done in Northern Ireland as being really credible. You know, the violence was not credible, I think, as a moral project. And you had John Hume and all his followers setting their face against violence. So I see John Hume's strategy of non-violence as connecting easily enough with the freedom struggle. That's the first thing I would say, which keep the Troubles in Northern Ireland separate to the previous story. And then the other point, I think, is James Connolly's point. You know, we forget today how terrible the Great War was. It's a terrible waste of life, and the scandalous way in which Christian churches basically excommunicated one another. That was what Pope Benedict XV was talking about with his appeal in November 1914, which Mandelstam wrote about. So, you know, at a time when, you know, there were terrible things being done in empire, you know, look at the Germans apologizing just the other day for what they did in Namibia, which they acknowledged as genocide. If you look at what the British were doing in Iraq in 1920, Mesopotamia, and the racial basis for what was being done.
But I agree with you totally, but all of this could become whataboutism, because, you know, Pearse has bloodshed as a purifying, sanctifying thing, which is the worst rhetoric of World War I. And Sinn Féin today are fighting their history wars, and they will never accept your effort to distinguish the IRA of that time and the IRA of their time.
Well, they may not accept it. They may not, but the mainstream, the SDLP, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and so on, they will see the distinction. And I mean, that picture of Pearse, I don't think is a full picture of what he stood for.
Of course not, but there's a contamination of the two worlds that you're trying to divide, the world of the trenches of World War I and the world of the GPO of 1916. It was the same people, it's the same world, and it's all interlinked. I mean, shipments of arms from Germany, it all hangs together.
Well, I recently reread Casement's very interesting essay about the war, which he published in September 1914. And it stands the test of time. You know, Casement...
Where can I find that? That sounds wonderful. Where can I find that?
Let me see if I can just find it here. Hold on. I know I have it in my study here somewhere. This is the volume, the Crime Against Europe, writing and poems of Roger Casement. But interestingly, it's available for something like €10 through Amazon. I mean, this is an old copy, but it's been reissued in paperback. And I came across it because I was consulted by some people in Oxford who were trying to understand the debate that was going on in Britain before 1914 as to whether empire was legitimate. So there's the question of whether the British Empire should be converted to a commonwealth, and then secondly, whether in fact they should go further than that and create a League of Nations. And it turns out that Casement was rather well connected with those discussions. And what Casement felt was that maybe, I think it's fair to say, the First World War cut off the possibility of more benign developments. And in Germany, the Social Democrats voted for the war budget, didn't they, in 1914? So what the First World War did in Germany was to cut off social democracy. And maybe the First World War effectively cut off the benign evolution of Russian politics. Maybe I'll ask our Russian friends to comment about that. But if there had been no First World War, then would Stolypin's vision of moving towards constitutional government have prevailed? So
absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, the First World War was not a very good thing, and I think the 19
was the most disastrous thing for the Russian history, I think.
So the 1916 people felt that they could not become part of the ideology of the Great War, and that unless they did something symbolic, that issue would be buried by history. And so they took this existential decision to do something that fell outside the category of ordinary morality. But I don't think that it was a wrong action as we conventionally think of that. It was maybe an existential choice. But that was my view. But it's interesting. It just shows that this work is that the poets were doing is important. Yeats. There's another thing that I have come across, which is the meeting Yeats chaired in late 1914. It was meant to be in Trinity College, but it was banned because it was known that Patrick Pearse would be a speaker and that he would be against conscription and against recruitment into the British Army. So it was moved to another venue, and there was a debate between Pearse and Thomas Kettle, chaired by Yeats. And Yeats advanced this plea that we should at all costs preserve the truce of the muses, so that everyone should respect one another, even if they disagree. And of course, Kettle died in the war and Pearse died executed in 1916. So they both carried their viewpoint to a logical conclusion. But Yeats felt that poetry could create the space for this debate to happen.
Well, thank you, colleagues, for this very intensive and interesting discussion. Of course, there is a lot still that we can discuss on that matter and continue. Thank you, Philip, very much for your participation and for putting such a high, standard of discussion. And thanks to Joseph for asking those questions. Now, I pass the word to our next speaker, who is Dr. Tatiana Ponomareva. And she will speak about Pavel Leopoldovich Leon, James Joyce Eurasian Night. So we start now themes connected to James Joyce more closely. Tatiana is the head of Vladimir Nabokov Research Center of the Russian immigrant culture in the Herzen University. But what is probably even more important, she is another co-founder of this conference, because 15 years ago, the conference was co-founded by Professor Dermot Keogh from University College Cork, who brought a wonderful range of academics to us. And Tatiana hosted them, being a director of the Vladimir Nabokov Museum, which became the place of holding the conference for the other decade, until the last years. So I pass the word to Tatiana now as a specialist in this theme and as a co-founder of the conference as well, because today we have the anniversary 15th conference.
Thank you. Let me try to.
Is it working?
Can you see the photograph?
It's loading.
It's loading.
Yes, yes.
Very well, because I'm sorry, I'm not very good with
it works. Yeah.
Screen demonstration, but I'll try. Yes, so I'm going to speak about the person who is known as Paul Leuven. And in all biographies of James Joyce and in everything that's been written about James Joyce, he's usually mentioned because he was a very important figure for James Joyce during the 1930s, for this from 1928 till basically till Joyce's death. And actually, he's also one of the reasons why Bloomsday and the conference made its way into the Nabokov Museum in those old days, is because Vladimir Nabokov and James Joyce met in Paris through Paul Leuven and his wife. They were friends of both Joyce and Nabokov. That friendship did not continue really, they only met once. So, but Paul Leuven continued to play a very important, continued to be a very important part of James Joyce's life. And the title of my talk is Joyce's Eurasian Night. And this expression is borrowed from an inscription that James Joyce wrote on a book. He gave his edition of Finnegan's Wake, when it was finally published, to Paul Leuven with that inscription. Now I quote, "To that Eurasian night, Paul Leuven, with 1,001 thanks of that most distressful writer, James Joyce. Paris, May the 4th, 1939. So let's look at this man. Let's look at Paul Leuven. Why was he Eurasian and why was he a knight? Because both of these characteristics are very accurate. Paul Leuven was really called Pavel Leopoldovich Leuven. That would be his full name. He was born in St. Petersburg in 1893. There are very sometimes different sources give other dates as his birth, but the accurate date would be 1893. He was born in a rich and cultured Jewish family. His father was a businessman, merchant. He is listed as a merchant first guild, which means that he was in this upper layer of traditionally they were merchants were in these old Russian traditions were put into three guilds. So the upper guild was of course the most prosperous, the richest business owners. His mother was a trained musician, but she didn't play concerts. She devoted her life to her family, to raising children. Pavel Leuven had several siblings, of which probably the most famous is one of his sisters. I'm going to. There's a portrait of his sister here. Her name was Henriette, and her married name was that's her. Her married name was Hirschman. Hirschman in Russian is Girschman, and she was the wife of a very famous art dealer and collector, Vladimir Hirschman, who lived in Moscow. She lived in Moscow, and she was portrayed many times by the leading Russian artists of that time, and she also had an artistic salon where all the major literary and cultural figures, musicians, composers, artists all met. So she was really very well known in the pre-revolutionary Russia, as well as her husband. The entire family, the entire Leuven family fled Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution and settled in Western Europe, and later some of them moved to the USA. Paul Leuven, that's his another photograph. He received education in law, but apparently he never practiced law. I couldn't find any indication that he was ever practicing lawyer. Apparently his interests leaned more towards art and history of literature, history of philosophy, and the several works that he published on various legal issues had to do rather with the philosophy of law than any specific legal problems. In 1914, he, like many people at his age, of his class, volunteered for the army. And after the Bolshevik Revolution, he apparently, this part is not very well researched, but according to his wife, he spent some time fighting in one of the White Armies, the army led by General Denikin, fighting against the Bolsheviks, as most officers did. Then he had to flee Russia, as again with millions of other Russians. Eventually, he settled in Paris, where he spent the rest of his life. Like most Russians, most Russian refugees, he never accepted any other citizenship. He had a chance to become a French citizen, but he didn't accept it. He preferred to remain Russian, which meant to remain a stateless person. That was his legal status, a stateless person, like most Russian refugees all over the world. Their only ID was the so-called Nansen passport. It was called so by Russians because it was, of course, Treaty of Nansen who started this campaign to give legal status to millions of refugees. And they had this ID, refugees ID, which Russians called the Nansen passport. So that's the only, that was his only ID all through his life. He was until that time, his life seemed similar to the life of Vladimir Nabokov, for example, and many other Russians of those years. Like most Russians, he spoke several languages, French, English, and German. So to him, adapting to European culture was not difficult, of course, even though, of course, his home language remained Russian. But there was one difference, which I think let him become part of the circle of James Joyce, and that's a very simple thing. Unlike most other Russians, he was in that minority of Russian families who retained some independent income. Apparently they had some, well, obviously his family had some assets outside of Russia, in Europe somewhere maybe, or in other countries. So he and his wife could more or less retain their lifestyle was not like the one they had in Russia, of course, but it was more or less comfortable so that he could pursue his scholarly interest and didn't have to work at a factory or being a night taxi driver like many Russians did. So his work was, he became the secretary of the journal called International Archives of Sociology. He also was one of the active members of the Society of Sociologists and Philosophers, and he was writing on the history of philosophy and history of literature. His main interest in this field were Benjamin Constant and Rousseau. But he never really published anything on history of literature. He just was busy with, we'll see what was his main occupation in these years. I will talk about it later. So in 1921, he married another fellow refugee. Her name was Yelizaveta Matveevna Ponizovskaya. That would be her full name. She was brought up in a family which was very similar to Leuven's family, also a rich and cultured Jewish family, but her family was from Moscow. She was born in Moscow. Later, she became known under a pen name. She became a journalist, an English language journalist, writing on fashion. And she visited those fashion shows in Paris and wrote for the newspaper International Herald Tribune. She was a staff journalist. And she signed her articles Lucy Leon. So Lucy, it was a name that she was called in her family. She was called, as was a tradition for Russia, she was called not by her full name, Elizaveta, Elizabeth, but by a short name, which was Lucia. That's why she decided to use this name as her pen name. So she became known as Lucy Leon. Both of them came from, this is important, that both of them came from families that were highly assimilated in the Russian society. So even though both families were Jewish, but neither of them received any religious Jewish education. They didn't have any. That was also very typical. That class was very numerous in Russia. They didn't have any interest in the Jewish faith. Rather, they had more interest in Christianity. And in her short memoir of her husband, Lucy Leon, later wrote that though born a Jew, he was deeply religious in a Christian sense. If he had not adopted the outward signs of Christianity, I'm certain he was prompted by a feeling of dignity, preventing him from doing so. This is frequent in many Jews believing in Christianity. He felt that during his lifetime, it would have been misinterpreted. Besides, there was the conviction that a man is free to worship as he chooses. Also, in the old days in St. Petersburg, socially, there was no anti-Semitism. It existed politically, but certainly never affected the lives and moral tranquility of my husband's circle. She even mentions later that he was sometimes even shocked by the irreverence that James Joyce showed towards religion, towards organized religion. So they met. These two people, James Joyce and Paul Young, met first in 1928. They met through one of the brothers of Lucy, Alexander Ponizovsky, who would later also perish in the Holocaust. He was a friend for some time. He was a friend of Joyce's son, Giorgio Joyce. They were more or less the same age. And that's how they met. That's how Alexander first met Joyce himself, and then he made Joyce meet her sister, his sister, and her husband. That's how the two men first met. It's interesting that in his letters to his wife, he was writing in Russian, of course, but later his wife published a few letters. Now more of them are published. And they're translated into English, but he called Joyce Papa Joyce, because the first person he met was not Joyce himself, but his son. So he called Papa Joyce. So he first met Papa Joyce in 1928, and they became very close friends. So what was the nature of their communication, of their friendship? Because very often Paul Young is described as Joyce's secretary. This is not true, because he was never a paid secretary. He never received any salary from James Joyce, even though Joyce often offered him a salary, but he refused because first because I think he had his independent income. He didn't really need this salary, but also because he wanted to preserve, as his wife writes about, he wanted to preserve independence and to be able to talk about Joyce without being to share his opinion of Joyce's work without being dependent on his salary. So again, let's look at his wife's memoir. That's how she describes their friendship. Joyce needed a friend on whom he could depend for practical advice and spiritual consolation. My husband Paul, because of his interest in Joyce's work and his affection and deep sympathy for Joyce the man, became that friend. He transcribed and corrected manuscripts, read aloud to Joyce. And we remembered, of course, that at that time, Joyce was almost blind. He couldn't read himself, so he needed somebody to read to him. And Paul Lyon also read a lot. He read novels. Well, there's his wife lists some of the he was a constant reader to Joyce. So he transcribed and corrected manuscripts. He read aloud to Joyce, took care of business and personal mail, and saw the contracts with publishers. And of course, his legal education helped him to solve all these issues. During the 1930s, he assumed many burdens which might have prevented Joyce from getting on with his principal job. So he devoted an unbelievable amount of time to helping Joyce. They met nearly every day, nearly daily. Joyce would come to the apartment. They had an apartment in well, that's the building where Paul Lyon lived before he left Petersburg. Let's see. Yes, that's where I couldn't get a good picture of the house, but that's the street where they lived in Paris, where they had the apartment in Paris, Rue Casimir Perrier, number 27. So Joyce would come there almost every day in the daytime, and they would sit down to talk and to read, to talk about, to discuss the what was written from what would later become Finnegan's Wake. So the amount of contribution that Paul Lyon brought into Finnegan's Wake is huge, as I understand it. It cannot be overestimated. And interesting that in the same building where they lived, there is this sign about another writer of Russian origin who was known as a French children's writer, La Comtesse de Ségur, but she was really Russian. Her name was Rostachina. So it's just a coincidence. So they met. That's how their life went. Meeting almost every day, discussing, reading, translating, because along with Samuel Beckett, Paul Lyon also helped to do that translation into French, because his French was also perfect. So he helped to translate parts of work in progress into French. And there is a description, there is a memoir written by Philippe Soupault, by the French poet, who took part in one of these sessions in which they discussed the translation and brought corrections. And he mentions that most of the work was done by Paul Lyon. Now we are in 1940. In 1940, along with thousands of people in Paris, both the Joyce family and the Lyon family, they had at that time their son was at school. They fled Paris when it was occupied by the Germans, and when Paris fell and the war was unexpectedly short. And they fled and they went to live in this small village where their friends, the Jolises, also lived. The village was called let me check. I forgot the name of the village, but it was actually not far. Yes, it was called Saint-Gérin-le-Puy. That's where they lived, and they just stayed there hoping to go back. Of course, they all expected that they could go back to Paris, but they lived there for several months. Then Joyce, as we know, never went back to Paris. He went to Switzerland, where he later died. And the Lyon family went back to Paris. Why did they do that? That's quite understandable. Their apartment was in Paris. All their belongings were there. They obviously didn't have much to live on, and they needed their belongings. They needed their personal belongings. They needed their books. they hoped to resume work because, as his wife writes in her memoir, she still could get her work in this newspaper, in the International Herald Tribune, because life in Paris was resuming. And obviously, they did not really feel as many other Jews, they were not the only ones. They didn't initially feel the amount of danger that they were facing. So they went back to Paris, and they also took care. They had this request from James Joyce to take care of his belongings, of his archive that was left in his apartment. Joyce and his wife, they rented an apartment in Paris, and when they left and stayed in this village, they didn't pay their rent. And the landlord demanded rent. When the rent was not received, the landlord decided to sell everything that was in the apartment at an auction. This was a hard blow for the Leons, because they tried to negotiate with the landlord, but failed. Landlord was set on auctioning the things off. So the only thing they could do was go to the auction and try to buy as many valuable things as possible. And so they did. They went to the auction. This must have been difficult, quite morally quite difficult for them, but they stood through the entire auction. They bought most of the books, everything that they felt was important, all of the archive. And later it was taken to the Irish mission in Paris, where it was stored during the war. And then well, we know that now most of the archive is in National Library in Dublin, and that was Joyce's, or rather Paul Leon's decision, that he wrote a note to this archive, saying that they are not to be, that they must go to the Dublin Library, and they are not to be opened before 50 years from now. So 50 years was in 1990, so then it was opened. And while still in Paris, Paul and Lucy Leon learned of Joyce's death. Of course, there was no communication, there was no mail going between Switzerland and Paris, so they learned about his death from a Swiss radio show. They listened illegally, in the clandestine way, and they listened to the Swiss radio, and that's where they learned about Joyce's death. Now we are in 1941, and in August 41, Paul Leon was arrested. He was arrested, and along with thousands of people, was taken to this infamous place called Drancy. There is this photograph of the Drancy concentration camp, where thousands of people were brought. There he spent several months. All communication was forbidden, but there were still ways bribing some people. There were still ways to exchange letters. So there was some exchange of letters between Paul Leon and his wife. One of the things that he, apart from books, one of the things that he asked her to do was bring him Bible, Gospel, Christian Bible. And in one of his very last letters, he wrote to her that he was very, it was very difficult because books were not allowed. So his wife had to, she was dressed as a nurse, and she had the help of a Russian priest. So with great difficulty, they managed to convince the guard, who was French, not German, but French, on that day, to take gospel to that prison, to one of the prisoners. And in one of his last letters, Paul wrote, "Thank you, this has restored our faith but how close I feel to the Sermon of the Mount. Also, in the letters that they exchanged, he was constantly worrying about Joyce's family. And again, in one of the letters, he was asking when, in the letter written in December 1941, shortly before he was taken from Drancy to another concentration camp in Compiègne and later to Auschwitz. In one of these last letters, he was writing to his wife. The letter is from December 6, 1941. Just in case I forget, the 13th is Saint Lucy. Would you ask Beckett to send something to Lucia Joyce and give him 200 francs in memory of her father? So he, even there in this being starved and almost dying already in this camp, he was thinking about Joyce's family. He was thinking about Lucia Joyce and about her day and trying to help them. So what we know, what happened later is that from Compiègne, again with most of the prisoners, he was taken to Auschwitz and murdered there in April 1942. And of course, in the death certificate that was later available and that can be found in the archive, of course, even though he was thinking about Mount of the Sermon, of course, in the death certificate, he was called Jewish. So that's why this was so important. Now we still don't know enough about him, and still there's a lot more to learn about this wonderful person who did so much for James Joyce, who helped him so much, and who himself could not survive. His wife survived. She survived the war, and she later went to live in the United States, and then came back to Paris and died in 1972. But now the archives are now mostly open, so more and more is now known about Paul Lyon. And I hear that there will be a book published about him by an Irish scholar who worked with his archives in Dublin and who interviewed Paul Lyon's son, Alexei in Russian, or Alexis. And hopefully this book will be published quite soon. So then I hope to read it myself, because I'm sure there's a lot more material in it, and the publication of the archives, I'm sure will present new discoveries for us. But this is basically what I was going to tell you about this person, especially about the Russian part of his life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very, moving story of this, really, as you mentioned, the wonderful person who helped so much Joyce throughout his hard years. Now I'm welcoming any kind of remarks and questions. Colleagues, please. Anything you would like to ask or to mention or to comment on what you heard?
I would just like to say that this talk partly continues this idea of humanizing and personalizing of many things, like, other talks. Unfortunately, I had to get out of the conference and then come back, so I didn't hear the very beginning of it, but I am really impressed. I think it was very interesting. Thank you very much.
We have a remark of Professor Grace Neville in chat. First, she wrote that she would know a lot of people who would be very interested by that talk, Tatiana, and by this information. And now she also wrote, Leon should be a national hero in Ireland.
Yes.
Not better known.
Yes, exactly. That was actually, that was one of the reasons why I was I first got interested in him, and why I hope to continue that, because I think he's such a great figure, really. Sacrificing his time he was practically serving Joyce. He felt so much admiration for Joyce as a writer, for his art, that he served him that's why you called him a knight, because he was really a knight. He served him as a knight, as his master, and it's just a fantastic story. I think there are so few stories like that of such a selfless devotion to an artist to help him develop his art. That's what Paul Leon did. Mm-hmm.
Grace wrote also, there should be a scholarship or annual award in his honor.
Yes, I agree. I agree. I'd welcome that very much. Yes, I think he should be more known in Ireland. Yes, that's. Hopefully, this book, when it's published, it will bring more attention to him.
And what is the academic link of this scholar who is working?
He's from, as far as I don't know him personally, but I've found this information somewhere. I think he's from. I think he's from UCD. Mm. He's from UCD, and his name is Dr. Luca Crispi. So he must be of Italian origin, Dr. Luca Crispi.
Probably Philip heard something about him and his work. I don't know if Philip can hear us still. Mm. Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. No, I didn't know about it. It was a wonderful talk. Mm-hmm. An unsung hero, definitely.
Mm-hmm. So the book is. I think the book should be published very soon because it mentions the plan. It should be 19 because I was speaking about 19. It's 2021. So hopefully later this year, maybe we'll see the book published. Mm-hmm. I look forward to it very much. Mm-hmm. Because of course he worked with a lot more materials. He worked with the archive in Dublin and with Paul Leon's son. Mm-hmm.
That's historically really great. First, he served, as you said, the knight for James Joyce. Then he linked Joyce to Nabokov, though there was no friendship, but he was the link. Because of him, they met, and we have this historical evidence. So a lot of very important things.
Yes, and I'm sure there was more. We just don't know enough. Yes, I'm sure there was more which may not know, because his son was. Well, if it's not in the archives, then it would be difficult to find a more, because his son, of course, was a child then, so he couldn't remember everything, but hopefully he remembered enough. Mm-hmm. So
your article for our book, as a result of 3 conference, will be another contribution to spreading more information about Leon in Ireland, because half of the editions will be spread to Ireland. We agreed with Ambassador, and we agreed with our authorities in the Herzen University that when the book is published, half of it will be kept here in Russia and the other half will be in Ireland, because all the book will be in English. So I think that it will be another possibility for people to know more about this important figure as well. Yes, any other remarks or questions, please, colleagues? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this. I think it was very touching and moving, and I think everyone appreciated that you found this information and shared it with us today in our anniversary day of our conference. Thank you. We continue our program. As I mentioned, that was the first talk connected directly to Joyce, and now I'm passing the word to the next speaker, Professor Hedwig Schwall. Again, it's the 2nd year that Hedwig is here with us. Hedwig is director of the Irish College, Leuven Center for Irish Studies in the Catholic University of Leuven, I think the biggest continental Irish center in Europe, and her paper is called From Dubliners to Multitudes, Joyce's Inspiration and Caldwell's Transfiguration. So I pass the word to Hedwig now, please.
Thank you very much, Andrey. Can you actually all hear me? Because I've been having problems all day with everybody. I was linking in with Bloomsday in Mexico and in Germany and in Belgium and so on, which is why I'm so late. So I deeply apologize. I'm seriously annoyed with myself, but there you go. But it's one thing that you can hear me, so that's great. And thank you very much, Andrey, for organizing this and for having me. And the flight to St. Petersburg was very easy, so that's great.
So will you need our PowerPoint help? Yes?
Please, if possible.
Yes, yes, we both. Tatiana, do you have it?
But I also...
Я уже закрыла, я думала, что я вам передала, и все. Я просто должна сейчас выйти опять.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Just
I probably misunderstood your idea.
Do you want me to do it?
No.
We just decided who is going to do it because I have to get out and then come back. That's why Andrey is supposed to do it.
The problem is that I need to find it after so many presentations.
Yeah.
Just 1 second.
Well, let me use the time to thank Tatiana.
During the break. Yes, I'm sorry.
I mean, Tatiana's talk was really great about this Pavel Leopoldovich Leon. I didn't know him at all, but hearing that it's Luca Crispi who has written the book, that's really good news because he is a top Joyce scholar. So the book will get lots of criticism, and I mean positive criticism clearly, and so it will be well known throughout the Joyce world, which is great. Yeah. Oh, thanks. That was very quick, Andrey.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Разрешить редактирование, нажмите еще, разрешить редактирование.
Это где? Вот.
Вот здесь. Нет,
не
наверное,
хочет.
это надо было до демонстрации, просто очень мелко. Все нормально.
Вот так.
И теперь может быть слайд-шоу.
А вот так можно?
Так нормально,
так
но
крупно.
Слайд-шоу будет еще крупнее. И сначала.
Нажать сюда, да?
Нет, вот сюда, в меню там сначала, вот сюда.
Ну
все. Ладно, я должна вот на некоторое время
Okay. So it works.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, yes. So the reason why I chose this topic is actually to, first of all, put Joyce on the map again, and to compare him this time in a somewhat more critical perspective, as I compare him to Lucy Caldwell. And the stories by Lucy Caldwell that I'm discussing today are very new. Like she wrote 2 sets of short stories, Multitudes and Intimacies. And Multitudes is from 2016, and Intimacies is going to be published later this month. So in that sense, I thought it would be good to bring in something up to date. And so I would like to focus on the fact that Joyce in Dubliners focuses on scrupulous meanness. So he uses a kind of narrative in which he scrupulously indicates how mean people are, whereas Caldwell will do the complete difference in a different thing in her Multitudes, and she will use what I call the aesthetics of the good enough model. So Andrey, can you please move to the, yeah, thanks. So here are the covers of these 2 sets of short stories. They are each 11 stories. So it's all very well thought out, all very systematic, and each of the stories in Multitudes refers to one in Intimacies and vice versa. So in that sense, it's again 2 sets of stories that belong together. In the next slide, we will see, we will need a bit of background. And of course, Dublin of 1914 was rather sad. There was lots of poverty and lots of troubles, as I see that the Easter 1916 was a topic, so that led to the revolution because of all the poverty and the inequality there was. And in Northern Ireland, when we compare to what happened from 2014 onwards to now, of course, the Brexit is a very big issue. And if we want to take a look at Northern Ireland via literature, we could go by the book of Glenn Patterson. And he wrote this book, Backstop Land, in 2019, which I very, very warmly recommend to everybody because it's very accurate. It's full of data, but it's also very humoristic. So he tries to get some distance from all the sadnesses in order to be able to look at them and to analyze them. So he calls the Union Jack, for example, a flag of many crosses. So it brings a lot of the division, a lot of discussion about identity, which can be very violent. But Grant Patterson also says that not only the Union Jack is important, but also the Irish flag. But there he says that a lot of people I meet here are trying to imagine their way beyond the binary. So who want to break out of the orange and green mindset. So what he sees since the Good Friday Agreement is that people tend to go beyond sectarianism, beyond the dual system of society. But even though there is a lot of goodwill, there is also a lot of trauma still going on. And so he indicates that the suicide rate, both among policemen, among young people, especially among LGBTQ people, is very high, because he indicates that between 1999 and 2014, as many people had killed themselves since the end of the Trouble as had died in them. So that is really indicative of the fact that trauma is passed on in families. As long as it's not articulated, it's passed on. And so one of the examples, because I will focus on mother figures in this talk, one of the examples that Patterson gives of the situation of mothers is one that he saw in a film by Sinead O'Shea. A mother brings her son to be shot. And so this is about a woman who was invited by a real IRA to bring her son, and in order to be kneecapped. If she didn't do that, he would be killed straight away. So you see the choices in which that people have to make. And then it's also striking that the leader of Sari, which means freedom, liberation, says that violence will continue while there was a border of any kind in Ireland. Whereas, I mean, it's very ironic that he says so, because all the paramilitaries do with their violence is to make extra borders and form extra splits. And so they silence people, as we see in the famous book by Anna Burns. People are silenced, and that means that they are imposing what is called a rhetoric of sameness on the members of the community. So the big problem in Northern Ireland right now is that people cannot articulate their authentic selves, their trauma, etc. So as we see in the next slide, there are two topics that I would like to lift out of Dubliners in order to compare that with Lucy Caldwell's short prose, is that, first of all, there are next to no mothers in Dubliners. They are curiously absent. They're either dead, or they're simply not in evidence, or they are irrelevant, or they are bad because they're scheming, or they are a combination of the previous. Now, it was a relief for me to read an article by Jerry McGowan, who defended Mrs. Kearney in A Mother. And he says that she is not a male mother, but she's someone, at least a mother, who stands up for her daughter in order to defend the daughter. So it's striking that not only Joyce is negative about mothers, but also the critics, they also are rather negative about them. A second topic or theme that is very obvious, or that is obvious in Joyce and also in Dubliners, is that an epiphany is an important thing, except in Dubliners it's always negative. So in The Sisters, the protagonist is in doubt. There is no epiphany at the end. There is ambiguity in an encounter. There is disillusion in Araby. Evelyn ends in a psychotic crisis, etc. So there's always pseudo epiphanies. So what we will see, I hope, in Caldwell is that the epiphany there is much more positive. So we see that in the next slide. I'm going a bit fast because I don't want to go over time. What about mothers in multitudes? What about mothers in Ireland and in Irish literature these days? We see that in the 70s, feminism was a kind of movement that tended to identify the mother as the enemy. You should not be pushed into the role of a mother. But that is changing now, because when you read the anthology that Eilish Ní Ghuimhne edited, it's called Look, It's a Woman Writer, Irish Literary Feminist between 1970 and 2020, which came out last month, 2021. We see there that, and I quote, "Little by little, social mores shifted. Generally, our mothers urged us on. Free schooling gave women the confidence to express themselves, to form a sense of identity which deviated conspicuously from the national stereotype. So we see that mothers and schooling form a combination for people to step out of stereotype and to become their authentic selves. Nguivna herself says that in the 1980s, the Irish imagination changed. Women's lives and experiences of the domestic quotidian were deemed to be worth writing about. And why do I quote this? Because that's exactly what Caldwell will do in these two volumes of short stories. Now, it's not only Lucy Caldwell, but also Wendy Erskine, Bernie McGill, and Jen Carson, who these days in Northern Ireland write a kind of fiction in which the mothers are highlighted and are actually standing up for themselves. So what I would like to focus on in this talk is how Lucy Caldwell's mothers enable their children to articulate their real selves. And indeed, she says so also in an anthology that she edited in 2019 called Being Various. And the title there is very significant because she wants to invite people to step out of stereotypes and look at a variety of role models. And she there says in the introduction to the anthology, thanks to the Good Friday Agreement, psychologically, we were free to experiment with and to embrace pluralities and contradictory ways of being. So what we will see in these short stories is that all the women and all the mothers especially are energetic, positive middle-class women who are full of empathy. And yet there is one story in which the mother is not the good enough mother, and this is a term of Donald Winnicott, an excellent child psychoanalyst. And so the story is called Chasing. And why am I using this story? Because here she does use Joyce's meanness and his very scrupulous meanness, because every detail indicates that the protagonist does not get the chance of her parents to become herself. Indeed, she's impinged by her environment, and we see this from the very opening, from the very first sentence of the short story. And that's typical for Caldwell. Every sentence counts. It's like in Dubliners. Every sentence, every detail is there for a reason to characterize people. And for example, the opening of the story goes, the mother who says, close the outer door before you open the inner one, remember? Mum said, because the plants don't like the draught. The protagonist then notices that her parents have put up new fences 6 feet high, and they have a whole army of bins. So again, it's everything is binned, everything is contained, everything is stopped, everything is closed. And that is typical for imitative behavior for the not good enough parents. The not good enough parents press their children to imitate their own examples. So the whole story is about the clash between a child who wants to imitate her parents because she wants to please her parents, and yet she's sent to art school. And so, of course, art school is a disaster because there are two types of people, the imitative people and the creative people. She wants to be imitative to please her parents, but she needs to be creative at school, and that doesn't work, so she leaves school. It's also another detail that is significant is that when the protagonist goes to London, she meets her old babysitter. And that is the only thing she remembers of being at art school. So again, she goes back to the past, to the babysitter, to everything that is mimetic, that she can go back to in nostalgia. She then starts taking drugs with her friends in order to do something different from the parents, but she goes into a panic and comes back home. She then, when coming back home, she promises her parents that she's going to another art school, which is in their own town. And so, of course, the parents are delighted. And at the end of the story, you see that the protagonist says, I lay on my bed, gazing on the slowly twisting terrarium. For a moment, I thought of smashing it, but I thought it might hurt Molly's feelings, that's her sister's, so I didn't. I just let it hang there, still turning. So at the end, there is maybe an opening to an epiphany, maybe not. But the two most important stories are Through the Wardrobe and Multitudes. And Through the Wardrobe is a really beautiful story, which may remind you of The Witch, the Lion, and in the Wardrobe, which is a story by not Tolkien, the other one, C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis lived in the same street as Caldwell in Northern Ireland, but she reacts against him because, again, like Joyce, she thinks that Lewis is a masculinist, has masculinist prose, and so she goes against it. And indeed, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis says that at the end that girls should not go into nail polish and into nylons, etc. So they should not be so frivolous. Whereas Through the Wardrobe is all about a young boy who, and again, the opening sentence is very important. It starts with the bell dress. So there's a young boy who is taken to a toy shop with his mother, and he sees the bell dress, which is a dress from a Disney film. And he immediately sees that he wants it and that he wants to be a girl, which of course is a problem. Yet the mother encourages the boy to wear the bell dress and to enjoy the bell dress. And so the bell dress becomes what is called in psychoanalysis a transitional object. Now, in Joyce, you don't have any transitional objects because people cannot move towards another kind of being. So what is a transitional object? As I explained at the top of the slide, it's a cuddly toy or a piece of cloth which console children for the mother's absence and that allow them to fantasize and to articulate a world of their own. So that is exactly what it becomes to this protagonist because he feels that he doesn't know that he wants to be a girl, but he feels it partly. And so he feels his way towards a future thanks to that dress. So the dress will lead him to an epiphany. An epiphany is a word that is very often used by Bolas, by another psychoanalyst, and he says an epiphany is understood here as a moment of insight that allows the self to increase its reflection. The person looks upon himself and others in a somewhat new manner. And indeed, that is what happens at the end of the story. The boy sees that the dress is a sort of talisman, and he will look for an operation so that he can actually become a girl. But the story ends with a note on Northern Ireland, quote, "The GP will insist that there is no service anywhere in Northern Ireland that can help you." So again, there are often references to Northern Ireland, like in Dublin as there are references to Dublin, but it's all about psychology. So in the next slide, we see that again in Inextinguishable, there is another transitional object, but here it works in another way. The story starts again with a very strong opening sentence, quote, "3 days before my daughter died, she comes running into the kitchen and says, 'Mummy, you have to listen to this piece of music,' full stop." So it's never said how the daughter dies, whether there is a bombing, whether it's in Belfast or not, we don't know. Is it a car accident? We don't know, because that's not relevant. The whole story is about how a transitional object, in this case a CD, because the girl has actually ordered the piece of music before she died, and it arrived with Amazon 3 days after she died. So this is the only link that the mother has with her daughter who is dead. And so we see that the mother kneels in front of the CD player in order to listen very carefully to this music. And she hears that the music is very difficult, modern symphonic music, something that she's not used to. So we see that the mothers in Caldwell have a strong sense of the fact that the children are different from themselves. So they don't push them into a kind of imitative behavior. And so we see, as Bolas says, that a transitional object like this CD with music may not bring joy, but it opens up. It drives a shaft down into the self's unconscious. And the protagonist says, with music like that, with so many layers and stories in it, you need lots of repetition for it to weave its way inside of you. And indeed, later we will see that the brothers of the daughter who died will take up drumming. And so in that sense, the music actually leads the people to a positive outlook on life. Indeed, thank you for the next slide. So the mothers in Multitudes are always good enough mothers. And this is a quote, this is actually a term from Winnicott. And Winnicott is quoted in the previous to last point. And Winnicott, and this is very strange, is a psychoanalyst who is actually quoted within the story. So we have a psychoanalyst, like academic work, quoted within a short story. So the mother in the story says, I've been rereading Winnicott. His good enough mother is everywhere, as some things are when we most need to hear them. And she then says that a good enough mother is somebody who lets love prevail over fear. And she says fear is the absence of love. A good enough mother is a mother who both protects and yet challenges the child to do something new. So on the one hand, it's holding the child. On the other hand, it's sending the child away to do something else. And indeed, this story is full of examples of holding, because in the story, the mother, the protagonist, is holding the baby. The baby is only a few days old and is in danger of dying. They only have 50% that the baby is going to survive. So she has to be a really good enough mother. So she's holding the baby in her arms. She's holding him into song, into nursery rhymes. And the father is listing all the containers that they have in order to actually contain the child. They also tell the child that the world is a beautiful place and that he should stay to make the world better. So in that sense, they realize what Hannah Arendt calls the concept of natality. Natality means that each child that comes into the world is capable of new initiatives. Each child bestows faith and hope, these two essential characteristics of human existence. So again, in Caldwell always refers to parents who can be so positive towards their children that they help to realize the miracle of life, of human life, of realizing your own choices and your own life. And indeed, she says very, very briefly and very concisely that a good enough mother is someone who always embraces things freely and with the appropriate sense of space. So I then very briefly say something about intimacies. Again, this is about the good enough mother, because the final sentence of the whole volume, and I quote, says, love being a holding close and simultaneously a letting go. That is exactly what Winnicott is all about. And then in the next slide, we see that what are actually the significant differences between Dubliners and Multitudes. Well, first of all, they lie in the characters. So Dubliners is a set of stories where the protagonists go from being children and then 18 and 20 and God knows what and older, and the same happens in Multitude. So the ages of the protagonists go up and up and up, except they are not Dubliners, they're all inhabitants from Belfast, and they're not men like most of the protagonists in Dubliners, but they're all women, except one, this boy who wants to become a woman. So in that sense, again, there is a wider variety in protagonists in Caldwell. There are 22 protagonists, and yet no one gets a name. So again, Caldwell wants to indicate something that Wilfred Bion said, that a name seems to be an identity, but he says a name is actually always a contradiction. A name is a question, is a questioning one's identity. And this is very often illustrated by Caldwell by the names that she actually uses, but I can't go into that now because it would lead me to great detail. So she uses no names, whereas Joyce uses names all the time. And whereas Joyce focuses on mortality, on paralysis, and ends his stories with the dead, we see here a move towards life. The good enough mothers is a life-enhancing kind of energy. And indeed, we see that in the last story, which I just mentioned, Multitudes, where it's not so much about the dead, but about coaxing a baby to stay alive. So the characters are different, and then the narrative perspective is different as well. Instead of the scrupulous meanness of Joyce, which is free indirect speech invading the headspace of the protagonists in order to highlight their weaknesses, in Caldwell we get a you narration. And the you narration fulfills three positive functions. First, it is not invading, but it shows that being sad or being nostalgic or being obsessed or whatever is a general predicament. We all are sad or obsessed or whatever. So it is not mean, but it invites the energy. The you form addresses the reader, so it reaches out. And it is not about individual, but it is about the fact that we can have different emotions and we can address them. So the you is a kind of addressing oneself, is articulating oneself, which is so necessary in Northern Ireland. And then finally, the conclusion, do we have a feminist paradigm here against the masculinist narratives of the past? I would say yes. So there are no more essentialist representations of individuals. Instead, we get a stress on the relational nature of human beings. We have holding and detoxing models. And so there is no sensationalism, instead there is suggestion. The names problematize the idea of identity. So in that sense, again, it's different from Joyce. Instead of static individualism, we get interactional processes. Instead of transitional objects, we get plenty of them. Instead of powerful people, the focus is on the vulnerable ones. Instead of rhetoric of sameness, we have models who know that they don't know. So there is an active tendency to go for unknowing. And then finally, the imagination is celebrated in each of the stories because, as Caldwell says, imagination forms the muscles of emotionality, and that leads to real epiphanies throughout these short stories. Thank you for your attention, and I hope I didn't go over time.
Thank you very much, Hedwig. Plenty of information and of interesting comparisons. And for me personally, especially this theme of you, changing of the approach to you, it was really very remarkable moment. Joseph, I see have the question or remark, please.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I haven't read Lucy Caldwell, but I'm struck by the accuracy of your remark that all of the stories in Dubliners end with an epiphany. And looking through them, I see it's true. And in every case, it's a downbeat, deflationary, disillusioning epiphany. However, I deny that in the case of the dead, because I see the final epiphany there as Gabriel being shattered exactly in what you were talking about, his static individualism. It is shattered by his final conversation with his wife. And then the epiphany is beyond the self. It's an epiphany of the vast hosts of the dead. But that is not a thing tacked on at the end. Reread the whole story in light of that, with the constant flow of motifs of death and music, and the structure of the story in 24 sections, which I analyzed somewhere. And you will realize that it's an epiphany of what Rilke calls the Doppelbereich, the double realm, that we only see life properly when we see it as steeped in death, that there's a kind of communication between the two realms. And this is a story Joyce spent 9 months writing in Rome, the palimpsest city. The story is a palimpsest, and it's very different from the 14 other stories. And it is actually what raises Dubliners to a new height.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah. I mean, I made a few shortcuts because of the time, but yeah, you're absolutely dead right. And indeed, it's because he's steeped into this vision of his wife, Greta, and then finally here's the subtitle of what he saw, her being steeped in passion, that he is indeed aware of this whole layer that he was not aware of before. And so indeed, the whole scene widens. Yeah, you're absolutely right there. Yeah. True.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. Colleagues, please. Any other remarks or questions or comments, Tatiana?
I would actually like to say thank you. And once again, like last year and the same feeling this year, that you have this, very highly developed skill of making this, textual analysis, and it is so precise. And you do not just compare two works of literature, but you are doing it, bit by bit and very precisely, and it's really, really great. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I've been working really hard on these things, and I've had a few interviews with Caldwell as well, which made me feel more secure about what I was saying. And we had discussions about her use of names and the you kind of narrative, etc. So I felt backed up by discussions I had with her. Yeah, thanks.
Colleagues, please. Anything else? Any other remarks or questions to Hedwig? I understand that close to the end of the conference, people become a bit tired, but still, we still have some room for questions or remarks.
Well, I'm aware of the fact that it wasn't too Joyce focused, but then I always think we should maybe look at what Joyce does to others. And he just keeps being inspiring. It's amazing. It just never stops.
You know, Hedwig, all the day long, we are talking about very different things, starting from the medieval manuscripts. But in every talk, we remember about Joyce, because to this or that extent, some elements or some moments are corresponding to Joyce's texts in general and to Ulysses in particular. That's why he is always here, be it contemporary Irish literature or be it medieval manuscript or even some Russian poetry of the Silver Ages. Practically in all our talks today, we mentioned Joyce in this or that.
Yes, I was just going to say that I haven't read this work. But I actually I don't know this writer at all, but I'll now look into it. But it was very interesting. Thank you very much, and I think but to me it was very convincing. So thank you. Mm-hmm.
Well, I made a bit of a mistake in the sense that I contrasted Joyce with her good enough mother, whereas Joyce is a good enough mother as well, in the sense that he's both encyclopedic, so he brings so many things together that we can all be inspired by it, and on the other hand he's explosive. He has so much material that it makes us think in so many different directions.
Yes, I agree, absolutely.
So it's both.
He is like a universe from which we can take this or that element or part when we need it, and it's always every other day it's fruit of thought. Well, colleagues, please.
Can I add something?
Yes, Joseph, please.
Yes. Because in Ulysses, Joyce invents a new machine for generating epiphanies. And I think the machine is Spinoza. You know, Spinoza is Bloom's favorite philosopher, and he bores Molly to pieces explaining Spinoza to her. And that means that matter and mind are one and the same. So as Bloom walks through the streets of Dublin, he sees material objects, but they are epiphanies of some kind of mental reality. And this is a whole new way of generating epiphanies, which is not a negative one anymore. It's sacralizing every physical thing that comes up. What do you think? Yeah.
I fully agree. Yeah. And that's the greatness. He can just turn every tiny, minute little thing into something revelatory.
Something memorable, unforgettable. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Hedwig, for your brilliant talk. And I fully agree that Joyce and Irish literature also keeps keeping us inspirational. And every time we can find something. And I guess that speaking about Bloomsday, so this tradition is never ending, because every time there will be something new, something interesting. And when you take an approach like this, when you compare something, right, then well, it gives us room for almost anything, right? So, and I like this multidisciplinary approach. And when we compare things, well, we'll see that every time there will be something new. Thank you very much. So that was very well done.
Thank you.
Yulia, in fact, today we have the anniversary 15th conference. We started it back in 2006. And when we came up to building this link, when Professor Demotko visited us in St. Petersburg, together with Tatiana, as I mentioned, Tatiana Ponomareva, who is here, we decided to organize an annual conference. And when we thought about how we should call this conference, we decided to make it as wide as possible by the range of, possibility of talks, be it history, literature, multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, Irish, Russian, merely Irish, merely Russian, Western European as well. because Ireland and Russia, the past and the present, is very wide. So the decision was to make this Bloomsday conference as wide as possible, because Bloomsday is devoted to the most universal piece of literature that we have in modern times. And we decided to make our Bloomsday conference as wide as possible in terms of attracting different exchange of views and ideas and some academic research. So thank you for mentioning that Bloomsday never ends. Any other remarks or questions, please? Okay, thank you very much, Hedwig, once again. And I have here in chat, while during your talk, I got another message from Grace Neville, which was about Tatiana's talk about Paul Leon. She wrote that in Cork last year, a new bridge was named in honor of Cork woman Mary Elms, who lived in France during the Second World War and saved hundreds of young Jewish children. So Leon's name should be given to a street or bridge in Ireland too. That's what Grace wrote in chat. Well, colleagues, now we are coming to our last talk today of our conferential part. So, and I am inviting our last speaker today, Dr. Yulia Segayeva from the Herzen University Institute of the Foreign Languages of our university, and her talk is called Joyce's Creativity in Progress, from First to Final Draft. Yulia Vladimirovna, I pass the word to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will later share the examples, right? Because there will be many examples of creative coinages of James Joyce from Finnegan's Wake, and the talk is based on Finnegan's Wake, as you could guess from the title, because this work was called Work in Progress when it started in the 20s. And but before I start, once again, I want to thank you for inviting me. That's the second time, and it's so remarkable that we are doing that on that very day, on Bloomsday. So it's great honor for me to talk about Joyce on Bloomsday, right on the day. And the novel Finnegan's Wake, as you know, in spite of its extensive and intensive research by specialists of any kind, is still a riddle for readers, for researchers and linguists, literary critics, and historians, all other specialists. They are all involved in this unique literary game started by James Joyce, the game to decipher all layers of the information placed in this unique text world created by James Joyce. You remember that all those multi-layered constructions you can find in the book, not only in Finnegan's Wake, of course, but I am talking about this book only. And this unique way of fusing words, specific narration, were used by Joyce, as you know, to create a special language, the Wakese, the language of night, which is in a way similar to some other literary languages like Zaum by Velimir Khlebnikov, if we compare that with our Russian literature, or Natsat, the slang that was devised by Anthony Burgess for the clockwise orange. So it's not just a case of coining words, but making a new literary language. And to understand this language, it's not an easy task. We can only approach to its understanding, I guess. And it's necessary to examine, for me as a linguist, to examine the writer's models of designing new words, what strategy of creative transformation of the text he used. So I will share a little bit of some findings of the structural and semantic analysis. And let me share now the screen. Just a moment. Okay, is it on already? Can you see the file?
Yeah.
Let me see. Whether it is centered enough for you to see the whole text. Just a moment. Can you see the whole text? Right. Okay. So I've just put here some examples because it's impossible to read them aloud and to explain. But we are not going, to examine every word, every coinage, just to. But before we talk about diaries, so it's probably it's worth having a look at the variety of models suggested by James Joyce in his work. And the analysis, first of all, showed that among more than 30 models of compound and derived words used by the writers, the most characteristic construction, the most characteristic patterns, is better to say, would be patterns of this kind. So, by the way, compounding and affixation would be leading ways of word building in this book. And you can see that he combines really adjective and noun and all other parts of speech, but not only those notional parts of speech can be combined together, because it's normal for English language to have adjectives and nouns together and noun plus noun, so there is nothing new, right? But you see that in the majority of his words, we have 3 or more components with or without affixes, not just 2, which would be more maybe traditional for English language. And what is more, he combines notional parts of speech with functional ones, like here. Nouns and prepositions and articles. Pronouns and prepositions. Nouns, prepositions, numerals. So no limits, so no boundaries for James Joyce here. And in case of affixation, and I've said that affixation is also very typical of coinages. In case of affixation, Joyce uses both productive and non-productive affixes. So productive affixes are here, like over, re, able, and many, many others. But what is interesting that very often in some words, he combines 2 suffixes together and 2 productive suffixes. Usually when you combine a word, we have 1 grammatical suffix, 1 lexical suffix, but here you can have 2 lexical suffixes together. It's normal for Russian language, right? But not for English. What about 2 prefixes? Again, not something strange for a Russian language, 2 prefixes, but for English, yes. And what is interesting here, we have some kind of false prefix. Again, so he plays upon with words even in prefixes, not only in roots of words, like misunderstanding. So it would sound like a normal word maybe, right? Without this false prefix, which looks like not a prefix anymore with these allusions. So almost all parts of speech can be substantivized by Joyce in his world, usually by means of ness suffix, like here to manyness would be a very good example. And as for complex hybrid constructions, like we can see here, and here it's like a phrase with the internal predication, and they not only make the nomination detailed, nomination is detailed and filled with additional meanings, but it creates an illusion of continuity of thought, some smooth flow of one sentence into another one. Another means of word formation used by James Joyce in his way keys, to create way keys, is blending, of course. And blending gives us, again, a room for playing with words, more than just combining words, not just like compounding. Because here we can have not just one image, but several images blended together with some additional meanings, like stupendous, stupid plus tremendous, or Delphast, which was used here. So the author deforms language, and the idea is to pour words, like to combine them in one single whole, or like in examples we could see here, Delpha Stupendius, or just maybe, or in many cases, decomposing them in the constituent elements, again, to get some additional meaning, like if you asked me and I sack you, it's not just, you know, some kind of alliteration punning or something like that, but the name, the Isaac, is like decomposed here in the sentence. Then we can say that the regrouping of semantic components adds, like I already said, new senses, some evaluation, some new visual and sound images, like in silver plate. We can see punning on not just silver plate, but silver plate plus this French expression. I'm not strong in French, probably do not know how to pronounce it correctly. Silver plate, like here you are, right? Something like that. And as for Joyce's love for foreign words, for foreign suffixes, prefixes, and roots, so we'll see that in some other examples. But here I want to say that all means enumerated above, all means given here, make the language of Finnegan's Wake to the highest degree elusive, I mean, filled with images, with associations, with some connotations, with lots of connotations, humor, satire, and above all, I'll repeat it, creates the effect of being unconscious, half awake, half asleep, which is true about the main character of the book. So this flow of words becoming larger, first one word, then a word group, then whole sentences. So it's like a flow of consciousness makes the illusion of their spontaneous creation by the writer. But is it spontaneous? Was it like the case, like James Joyce decided to write something and then it was like a train of thought in his head and all those interesting words and combinations were right in his text, like the river flows? No, of course not. And this illusion of the spontaneous creation is misleading, is wrong. But the question is, how did he change the words? Step by step, or he knew right from the start what the final form of the word would be. So how could he come to this craziest form of all. So how did you decide the craziest form of all? To see the process of creating the new words in progress, to understand the so-called logic of creation according to is impossible according to the eventual result. So it's impossible when we just have the final version of the book, read it, and without knowing how it was done. So it's impossible to evaluate. But this is where we need diaries. This is where we need drafts, some books and volumes of notes which were left by James Joyce in great numbers. Not all of these books are decoded, are deciphered. You know that the books were bought by American university, and they study those books, but many things are still not clear from those diaries because of the handwriting, because of some codes, because he decoded many things there, and it's a great actually asset, right? The university now, not one university, of course, but several universities have, and some diaries are open, or some parts of those diaries are open, but unfortunately not that many. Let's now have a look at some examples from Joyce's drafts, some examples that I could collect to illustrate the points. So we'll illustrate the transformations of words in one of the sentences. Let's take one sentence. What is interesting, before we do that, I'll comment on this, that we know that Joyce's diaries, I'm talking about the diaries for Finnegan's Wake, of course, right? Joyce's diaries, a series of notes, they were started in 1923, so 4 years before he began to publish first printed fragments of Finnegan's Wake under the title Work in Progress, because he started publishing it in 1927. So that, but diaries, you see, 4 years before, he started visioning, right? So all this new world, and moreover, the diaries, just like Work in Progress, appeared long before the final variant of the novel, which you remember was released in 1939. But by the way, the study of Joyce's manuscripts, as I've already said, notes, diaries are still very active in the framework of genetic criticism. And I know that there were several books published on genetic criticism, this postmodern methodology of the reconstruction of the history, genealogy of the text. And I liked a lot the book by French scholars, Finnegan's Wake, chapter by chapter, genetic criticism. But there, the idea, in these books, in these studies, the focus was mainly not on language, but on characters, on ideas. So how so the idea was developed, but I was interested more in language, in words, because I study lexical creativity. That's why I was more interested in this too. And to illustrate my idea, what I wanted to study, I'll show you the sentence which could be found in the first version of Finnegan's Wake draft, which appeared in 1923. And you see, the sentence sounds like a normal sentence: a glass of Connell's famous old Dublin ale, right? So it is written perfectly in a in accordance with the standards of English language. But then, sure, we understand that it was not the point, right, to have the text sounding like this. It was not the idea of James Joyce. So in final version, we read a glass. Well, again, it's not my maybe. I would say it's not a good idea for me to read it, right? But you can see that it's an not absolutely, but it has changed, right, greatly. And what was interesting that when I compared several versions, not like first one and final, but there were also some intermediary drafts, right? Not from all books, from all chapters, but some chapters. So we could see how the sentence was born. A glass is there, is still there, but see, O'Connell's, if I'm not mistaken, that was their name of a well-known pub, right? Not only in Ireland, I guess. Please correct me if I'm wrong, right? But that was like pretty much traditional name for the pub, right? A glass of Connell's, then O'Donnell's, and then some other variations. And you see that every time, so the word expands, right? Dan O'Donnell's, and then we have now alliteration added, so some word game. Famous and famous, sure, blending with foam, or foam plus famous, something like that. And Dublin, we know that he liked this name, this toponym, city place very much, and played a lot with Dublin. So then we get this. So you see that it took several stages, several drafts to come from the first to the last. But that's just one sentence. And I want to pay attention to maybe some trends. So what in general, maybe there are some algorithms, maybe there are some trends, some models, some, I don't know, something that would be something how we can explain why, right? And not why, but how. So what are the models James Joyce uses? So if you have a look at three variants of one sentence, just without even reading it carefully, you can see that they are not equal in size, right? The first one is shorter, well, which is normal, right? You should start with something and then you expand. But if you compare the first, the second at least, and the third, you will see that here we can so here we can see that if we compare the first version from the 8th chapter, that's the fragment from the 8th chapter of the novel. Number 2 is an intermediate version, and final version is this one. That's the final version. How it appeared in the printed book, it becomes obvious that the linguistic experiment is like a step-by-step language killing. Well, he used this word himself, right? I will kill language slowly, but then you'll get it back. Of course, it's not the exact quotation, sorry. But you'll see that there are some trends, some specific features we can find, we can summarize. And I tried only tried, right, to summarize them in the following way. So first of all, we can see that at different levels, at morphological and semantic and syntactic levels, we can see some kind of fusion, modification. And first of all, we can see this morphosemantic fusion of structures from isolated words to fused word combinations. Long to be chronicled, get together day, then 2 words just instead of these words. Then adding words and word parts of foreign origin. That's another typical feature. And we know his love of foreign words. Just to illustrate the point, again, to compare the first draft and the published version, you could see that in the first draft, it was getting the funk from the Hennessy. In the published version, kriegen, the funk from the Hennessy. And kriegen is the word of German origin with the meaning of getting something. So again, it illustrates that all these borrowed words, all words from other origins, they didn't appear right away, right from the start. So he carefully chose these words later to decide what to substitute with a foreign word, what probably is not necessary to substitute. Or like this, having his frock, you can see frock, and then kappa magna, a foreign word. Then, do I have time? Well, I won't do that for a long time. Sorry if you feel that it's too much.
I'm sorry. Yes, we are coming to be run out of time very soon, because we have all our Irish writers here. So I think we need a conclusion now.
Yeah, we need a conclusion. Yes, let's do the yeah. This is closer to the end. I'll skip this, so we can say that I want to show this quotation. So the conclusion would be like, why did Joyce do that? So the structural and semantic complexity of narration realizes the function of coding the text, which is difficult or sometimes impossible to decipher without the drafts left by the writer. Nevertheless, another key to understanding the author's code is the musicality of the novel. So that was the other reason why he modified the text, made it sound like this, because of musicality. He emphasized the musicality and rhythm of Finnegan's Wake, and answering to the critics of his novel, the writer advised not to read it, but except at the prosodical level, to feel the language of night and sleep. And among several versions of recorded fragments of his work read by professional actors, his own variant, recorded in 1929, is of greatest value. And according to Jolas, one of the contemporary, contemporary figure of that time, that's his quotation actually. The author's reading reveals this unusual musicality and rhythm of the unique writer's style. So you can see his quotation here. And this musicality is actually the result of all those modifications and transformations. And I can say it's true. Without drafts, without listening to Joyce reading his novel originally, my work was useless, right? I was stuck at some moment. I didn't know what to do. But after you know, after starting working with diaries and listening to Joyce reading it, I heard his vision of this rhythm, and only then did I understand that why the way keys should be fused and blended like this, to be deep and slow, like a river of ages. So let me finish with this. Sorry if
Thank you.
that was.
Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Dear friends, dear colleagues, I would ask you, now we won't have time for remarks and questions orally, but if you have something to mention, to comment, or to ask to Yulia, please do it in the chat, and we will read it afterwards and pass it to Yulia, definitely. Now I